See the numbers climbing. That's great. Thanks everybody for joining today. Welcome to the kickoff for this so-called R2O2R Research Operations Working Group. It's great to have everybody. I'm David McCall. I'm a senior scientist at Oak Ridge National Lab. I'm co-chairing this working group as of fairly recently, along with Gokul Iyer from PNNL, Pacific Northwest National Lab. I'm going to be playing the role of MC today, more or less, saying some words here in the beginning and then again toward the end. Most of the contributions are going to be from a number of other colleagues who will be introduced in time. Just so that folks know up front, we are recording this seminar. You can see the little icon in the top left of your screen. So your participation here today acknowledges your consent to be recorded. Let's go, Pat, to the next slide, please, the one with the ground rules. And I think this is obvious to everybody here, but it always bears repeating. Please be considerate, respectful of your colleagues here on today's call in order to promote a collaborative work environment. One of those actions would be just please keep yourself muted and raise your hand, and whoever is moderating or chairing at that time will call on you. There will be plenty of time for group discussion here in the middle and toward the end of this webinar. So folks will have a chance to be heard. Next slide, please. We also want to acknowledge here up front the wonderful support in several different forms from our colleagues at DOE, namely the Office of Science, Earth and Environmental Systems Modeling program, in particular the Multi-Sector Dynamics program area, which Bob Valario leads, and Bob's going to be one of our first speakers here today. So thanks, Bob, and thanks to your colleagues for the support of this activity over time. Let's move to the next slide, the agenda, and this will be where I will stop here before passing to Richard. So after a few words of introductions here in the beginning, I'll pass first to Richard and then to Bob to say, to give a bit of the backstory and the genesis of multi-sector dynamics more broadly, but then with a particular eye toward the researched operations topic and how it came into being and where it could potentially go over time, and therefore the need for this working group. Then we will have a panel discussion, including David Lesmus from USGS, Kripa Jagannathan from Berkeley Lab, and Jenny Rice from Pacific Northwest National Lab, each of whom is going to share just a few brief remarks, sharing their expertise and deep experience in this researched operations and operations back to research space, teeing up some of the discussions that we'll have later. And then, yeah, as I was saying, from the middle of the talk, the webinar onward, we're going to have a number of opportunities for group discussions right there following the panel, but then also in these two group discussion periods chaired by Jen Morris from MIT and Jordan Karn from NC State. And the basic purpose of those is to solicit inputs and ideas from the community, from the people who, at least who are here today, for where this working group could go over time. And we will make use of a couple of different shared Google Docs for that, which we'll share on the screen and folks can input ideas. And we'll discuss that a bit further. And then I'll come on towards the end and say a few words in closing and talk about next steps. And then we'll adjourn at 2:30. So with that, let me pass to Richard. You can go ahead and move to the next slide, Pat. And so Richard is on the MSD Community of Practice Facilitation team and is acting as the liaison between the facilitation team and this working group. And overall, he's just a general legend in this field, and so he's great. He's been great to have on board here as we're spinning this up. So go ahead, Richard.
Great. Thanks, David. It's great to be here, and it's great to have all of you join us. I just want to note that there are a number of new faces for the MSD Community of Practice. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time going over what will be familiar to some of you, but not all of you. That is, what is multi-sector dynamics as a research field? Just say a couple of words about our community of practice and how it's organized, and then maybe tee up some of the discussion you'll get in much more detail, some great content prepared by our speakers on the opportunities for this working group. So multi-sector dynamics is an evolving field of research, field of science that's really focused on understanding the complex interactions between human and Earth systems and how those interactions impact us from day to day. And you can see in this diagram, which has really become an iconic figure for the community, some of the influences on the left-hand side in the outer circle, some of the climate-related influences. And then on the right-hand side, sort of where it's a little more peach-colored, some of the socioeconomic influences, things like technological change and population dynamics. And so our research area really seeks to understand how these different human and earth systems, which are in the inner circle, shape our interdependent pathways of societal change as we look at both social forces and at environmental forces. Next slide, please. So in order to study such a broad range of topics, we really need to embrace a very wide range of disciplines. And this is something we've called the peacock diagram from a Earth's Future article, which was prepared by our scientific steering group. So you can see kind of at the tips of the peacock feathers, some of the main areas of science: Earth systems modeling, integrated assessment modeling, complex system science, socioecological systems, and so forth, that we are calling upon in our community. This isn't weighted by past efforts yet to contribute to the field. This is just a conceptual figure. And you can then see in the inner portions of the diagram what some of the methods are that we're pulling in, as well as what some of the challenges are. Next slide, please. So the community has prepared a really excellent vision document looking at the opportunities for our area of science out to 2030. And in the summary for policymakers, we kind of identify three overarching opportunities, which I've listed here. I'm not really going to focus too much on the first two, but just on the third. But just by way of example, when we talk about strengthening foundational research capabilities, we're talking about a real commitment to things like open science. And we actually have a special capacity, MSD Live, it's called, which helps us with that. Also computational innovations. We really want to draw on the very rapidly changing area of computation. And then things like workforce development, where we're really looking to grow and diversify the range of scientists who are involved in our area. Advancing the science of human and earth system interactions. This is where we really get into some of the meaty scientific challenges, for example, looking at understanding how extreme and high impact events propagate through these systems, and how they affect thresholds or discontinuities or tipping points, or diversifying how we represent human systems. Of course, we've always used economics very heavily, but we're increasingly using other types of modeling approaches. And another one, which I find particularly fascinating, is looking at how human responses to environmental change actually can amplify or reduce risk. Not all of our responses are adaptive in a positive sense, and we think this is a really fascinating area of science. So and the third area, providing scientific and decision-relevant insights under uncertainty, that's where we really start to look at the relationship of MSD science and user communities. And it's thinking really about approaches for collaborating with and learning from operational experts. One of our panelists will be really focusing on that. How we can inform science and model evaluation to address user-relevant metrics, something really important. We in the scientific community often have metrics that are important to our understanding of how models work, but are not as relevant to what the users need. And again, there's a project that will be discussed that's about that. And then, doing all of this under uncertainty. We have a working group focused on uncertainty quantification and characterization that's really developed some great methodologies. Next slide, please. So next to the last one for me, this is just a kind of overview of how our community of practice is organized. You can see on the right the main constituent groups who are involved in our community of practice. Includes, really importantly, a facilitation team that Pat Reed, Erwan Monnier, and Chris Vernon co-chair. A scientific steering group that meets bi-weekly, and as I mentioned, has been preparing some very important publications. We have 6 different technical working groups, and of course interact kind of constantly with DOE-funded MSD projects, as well as a range of sponsors. And on the left-hand side, you can just see some of the strategies that we use, including things that help accelerate communication, coordination, mutual understanding of what we're working on through a shared conceptual framework, and technical coordination through these working groups. And then the next one, please, my last slide. This is just to reflect a little bit on what the opportunities are for this specific working group that's being launched today. And the main focus is to identify opportunities for the entire community to grow collaborations with experts in applied R&D, both with the goal of providing them decision-relevant insights and also learning from them. And we hope in doing this that we're really going to elevate the visibility and amplify the societal impact of the scientific advances, which we hope we're accelerating. In a proposal that David and Gokul prepared, they looked at the ideas for the group, including stock taking existing approaches in R2O2R, identifying some gaps and charting ways to address them, and finally bridge building activities. So I'll stop with that and turn it over to Gokul. I think he's going to be. Oh no, wait! I did have one more slide. I'm sorry. Go on to the next one, please. So the last point I wanted to make, sorry about that, was that we did have a workshop in 2016 that kind of set the stage for a lot of this. And the workshop was an unusual one for our community in that it was really built all around 2 sets of use cases. So 8 different specific examples of decision-making that would be affected by these Earth system, human system interactions, and that we could consider to be core examples of MSD. The 2 sets were, one was a sort of co-evolving interdependent infrastructure systems, and the second one looked at the implications of drought and increased hydrological variability at local to international scales. And breakout groups for each of these 8 sort of went through 2 sets of considerations. One, operational considerations, so who the actors were, what scales they were working at, what metrics they needed, the decision alternatives that were before them, and uncertainties that affected the trajectories. And then we also tried to look at what scientific capacities existed to help provide the information that had been identified, including things like data sources, component models, and coupling strategies. And the workshop developed, I raise it, it's largely been superseded by the vision document, but I raise it for this group because I think a number of the ideas proposed here, including a living typology of use and some other concepts, could be helpful to the working group as it gets itself launched. So with this now, I'm going to pass it over to Gokul.
Thanks, Richard. So the next item on the agenda is will be a talk by our very own Bob Villario to offer some perspectives on R2O2R. So Bob Villario really needs no introduction to this crowd, but very quickly, he's the program manager for the multi-sector dynamics program area within the Earth and Environment Systems Modeling Program at the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Science. So over to you, Bob.
Thank you, Gokul. So first, I want to thank the organizers for standing up this working group, which I think is very timely and very, very apropos to, foci and interests we're seeing in government writ large. It's not just our group within the agency, but it's our agency, it's other agencies too, including our colleagues at NSF, who stood up an entire directorate with a predominant focus of doing some of the same kind of work. So it's a prevailing trend within government. Anyhow, I want to thank the organizers, as I said, and also the participants for joining today and the opportunity to share a few thoughts. These are my thoughts. So next slide. So, I'm going to look at this through and present through the lens of the science side, but I've worked on both sides of the fence before, so you should know that in my long career. But from the science perspective, which is what we're funding when we're funding multi-sector dynamics, and from other agencies that do similar type of work, we're really about understanding, hypotheses testing, search for knowledge, what use inspired, and increasingly translational. I'll give you a few examples of that have just unfolded over the last year or two within our group. knowledge, data tools, capabilities. We look at metrics like publications, right? And participation professional meetings, not exactly operational mission oriented per se. And then there's a general emphasis for us to stay in our lane while cozying up to and making our work, more societally relevant. And we're all undertaking those efforts. And then typical elements we engage in are theories and concepts, observations, experiments, modeling, data management and analysis, and application of really avant-garde tools like machine learning and AI and high performance computing as examples. Next slide. So basic research in federal agencies often have distinct features. I mentioned some common ones on the last slide, but they're unique to the agency missions. Oftentimes they have specific orientation of activities around disciplines or systems and collective integrated systems, such as some of the ones illustrated here. Institutional structures, whether it be around our group, which is biological and environmental research, and climate versus like the geosciences directorate at NSF, or WEDO, even within DOE, which is the Wind Energy Technology Office. We all do research and we all lean in on some of these components, maybe some of those less oriented around basic research, but relevant nonetheless. Geographies of interest. There's been a big focus recently within our group and other groups on geographies of interest, starting with coasts, and there's been a huge gain in interest on urban systems and even mountain hydrology as examples. And then societal challenges as illustrated here. You only have to watch the news to pick up on some, if not all of these in various ways. And the organizations have different cultures of connections of R2O2R. There's different pools of researchers, there's different support mechanisms that are used to engage. The size and duration of the activities have a play and a say, if you will, in what transpires, and whether it's transdisciplinary or focused or open or closed types of research activities. Some organizations do research or science, but they're as in the case with our national nuclear security area, right, where it's not open science, it's not published. Next slide. So you all have seen past year's quadrant. You probably, ate this for breakfast in some of your classes back in the day, if we can remember back that far. But I call your attention to a modification. Somebody who was writing some material on this had an interesting modification of including vision-inspired basic research and distinguished it from use-inspired basic research insofar as use-inspired is tell us what you need and we'll think about it and we'll get back with you. But vision-inspired is, can I think about where I want to actually take this, not in an application sense, but not do the application, right? If I were king or queen for the day and I wanted to pursue this in a way that could really make it useful for somebody, not just, it'll help inform some of our ongoing efforts. That's a very different set of questions. And they thought that was relevant. And I thought that publication was relevant, as you can see on the bottom right, if you're interested. Next slide. So, and another, I guess I kind of like this visual representation a little bit better because it actually speaks more to the intersections and the dynamics between the various pieces, where the other is more of it's a quadrant approach, right? It doesn't really speak to the interactions. But this representation, and you can see the author on the right, an adaptation of that. Basically, there's feedbacks to this, what we classically do in BERs, use-inspired basic research. We do some pure basic research, but in the climate space, a lot of it is use-inspired. But we're increasingly wanting to look at how these feedback mechanisms actually impact the use-inspired component. Next slide. So I just want to keep one thing in mind with respect to the last two slides and visuals that are presented. There's no clear boundaries here. Nothing's pure in this game. I mean, and I think the changes within biological and environmental research are a great example. Our climate program, we're setting up climate resiliency centers now to serve and to work with underserved communities in different cities and different regions. But there is still a major, and the significant focus is on the science component, but with considerable effort in stakeholder engagement and outreach, which is new to us, with the exception of a project we launched some time ago, which was Hyperfacets, that had a very specific focus on some of that kind of work around storylines. And then use-inspired research is a bridge. It already has some qualities of translational, but it's not fully translational. And in practice, a lot of this is iterative and nonlinear. It's not like do it once and you're done. Next slide. I won't spend much time on this other than to say that we're also looking at the same time, not just convergence on the innovation pipeline, I'll call it. It's not truly a pipeline, it's more like a spaghetti chart. But we're seeing convergence in fields and in topics and disciplines. And one version of this is reflected in our iconic image or a similar representation for the MSD space. But they have similar issues and perspectives at NSF, like linking discovery, innovations, and impacts, and some of the work they've done there. Next slide, please. So, one of the things I really wanted to communicate, because I know we're always hammering, stay in your lane, stay in the science lane. It's okay to meander a little bit, but it better not start looking like applied research or contract support for constituents or stakeholders, right? But there is a real value proposition in looking at O2R from a science perspective. So obviously, everybody wants to be more relevant and explore expanded use and recognition of your work within other communities. But one of the things we get back, and it's not just the what do you need? Okay, well, think about that, right? I mean, that's the typical perspective about use-inspired research. There is a lot to be mined here and a lot of potential benefits for the science community if we kind of throw off the chains of traditional thinking and think about what we can actually get out of it, and we should search for it, right? But you gain a deep appreciation working with stakeholders and others, more the operational side, with understanding real world limitations and constraints. And a lot of our socioeconomic work and behavioral and agent-based work, it's to understand that is to get the system right. And if we don't fully understand it, no matter what the scale, we're really not going to represent the system as it may evolve through time, right? So that's part of it, and understanding disturbances, behaviors, and influences, implications for theory and complex systems. There's a whole range of data and data systems available at these fine scales that we don't typically know about or have access to. So as we start jumping in with both feet in more regional, sub-regional, and local scale work, which is characteristic of our interests in adaptation research, et cetera, at these finer scales, we're finding a whole set of data and data systems as we engage these stakeholders and local communities. Same is true for observation monitoring systems. Same is true for detailed process and systems models, right? That we can bring in and connect up with our more aggregate models going all the way to regional and CONUS scale and global scale. So there's some real material and real good work, science work, to be mined at those levels. And then there's improved understanding of user and systems. This is a Richard, and we love this terminology, typologies, right? Say for regions and topics of interest, improve insight into decision rationale, agent-based behaviors, I mentioned that, and greater opportunity to learn and adapt. Next slide.
Well, 1 minute warning.
Gotcha. Okay, so it takes many forms. I'm showing you some of the forms here, right? But specifically targeted activities, you can look at the examples yourself, embedded activities, joint and interagency activities and workshops, such as some of the ones you've participated in, community and outreach, two very recent ones where another office had encouraged engagement with the California Energy Commission. So I briefed them on some of the work we're doing. They certainly have applications in mind, not basic research, right? And Jenny will probably tell you about the Texas Energy Commission as well. Then researchers' multiple funding sources, sponsor bridging. A lot of you work for more than just the Office of Science, and you bring these things together in those applications. Co-development of methods and tools, and joint modeling test beds. Next slide. I think this maybe is my last one. So it is, and it's principles for moving forward. So I would encourage you to double down on building this community of practice. I think it's very, very timely and critically important, with the caveat that it's the work you're doing for us, not necessarily other funding sources represented in your collaborations here. Ours is science. So, we need to be careful that we don't spill over in our enthusiasm and start getting into consulting services. That's just not our space, right? Consider other components and other agencies as potential users. There's a lot of leverage there. So when we do work with David at USGS and others who have more closer ties to true user communities, we get a multiplier effect in that, right? Strategize on specific mechanisms, tailored to unique circumstances. Think in terms of 3 dimensions, geographies, topics, domains, and methods and tools of interest, and ways to combine all 3. Start small, build successes, and expand from there. Orient around hypotheses informed by community societal needs. I mean, that's a clear, good place to start. And let's not focus on new money, certainly not now. I think we're heading into an era of tremendous fiscal austerity. We've had the benefit of some increases over the past several years, but I think those heydays are over, and we're going to have to figure out ways to leverage more effectively to get this thing moving. And that's the mantra I think we need to conform to going forward. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bob. I think we're running a little bit behind schedule, so I'm gonna move on to the next agenda item for today. Very illuminating thoughts, and thanks again, Bob. So the next agenda item is a panel discussion. We have 3 excellent speakers with us today to offer their thoughts based on experience on teaming with, informing, and learning from operational experts. So the first speaker for this panel discussion is David Lesmes. David is the director of the Integrated Modeling and Prediction Division for the USGS Water Resources Mission area. Welcome, David, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gokul. So I'm just going to share with you all a bit of work that we're doing at the USGS that touches on this research to operations space. Can the next slide? And the next slide. There we go. And so these slides were mainly presented by Katie Skalick, my colleague, who's the program manager for Integrated Water Prediction Program and developing capabilities that extend from local to regional to national scales. And she presented some of this at the AGU meeting last year. So next slide, please. And so in addition to that integrated water prediction, building the modeling capabilities is the application of those models in an integrated water availability assessments program, and 3 main efforts there, which is led by Lori Sprague, the program manager. And there's we're developing, as part of the Secure Water Act, a congressional mandate to do national scale assessments of water availability that includes water quantity, quality, and use. And that will also is informed by work going on in regional areas. Oops, sorry. I'm at the beach and the door just slammed at the really nice place here. I'm just up against the wall, but it's really, so anyway, so we do have these regional test beds that kind of Bob mentioned a bit in the Delaware River Basin, the Illinois, Colorado, Willamette, and now in the Trinity in Texas. And we tend to expand out to 10. And so through doing this work at these different scales, we're trying to build a capacity that can extend across scales of space and time, and also be able to do operational work in the form of the production of these kinds of assessments, reports, as well as eventually an online water census, which means routine operational serving of this information. So next slide, please. So we're not the only ones doing this. This is a recent report from DOE, the applied programs. Charles Skates, the program manager, and Oak Ridge was one of the lead groups with PNNL to deliver this assessment on hydropower. And the point I wanted to make here is what needs to go into an assessment of hydropower is very similar to what we need to do to assess water availability more broadly. So if you could do the next slide, please. So you can see, that they have to bring in the information about climate model evaluations and downscaling and hydrologic models, and including USGS models like PRMS and the VIC model, and then regional hydropower and so on. And so, this is just 2 of the 3 parts of the Secure Water Act and includes work by the Bureau Rec. And there's a lot of duplication of effort that could, lead towards both resources for the broader community, but opportunities to do things more closely together and to develop standards in which we could have interoperability and shared development of capabilities and use of these models in ways that would be more efficient and impactful. Next slide, please. So this is just to say for our challenge, and I'm not going to go into the details here, but Hedef SIE, Jared Smith are on the line, my colleagues, and we're also working with Pat and Andrew Hamilton at Cornell is part of a large group of people putting together different models of water quantity, quality, use, surface water, groundwater, to be able to evaluate, do these water availability assessments, focusing on basins, at first, like the Delaware and Colorado and so on, but also building capacities at national scales in a way that allows interoperability between these capabilities. So it's a big effort pulling together complex sets of models, but in coherent ways that we hope are becoming more systematic in the formulation and the support and in the extension of these models going forward in time, very much in the way ModFlow has been a USGS staple over the decades. So we're just trying to build on that kind of a capacity, but have it more extensive across the range of both natural and human systems, groundwater, surface waters, and water qualities. So it's a big effort, and we're kind of in the middle of it right now. Next slide, please. And we're not doing this alone. We don't have any intent to replicate, what's going on in other places. We want a team, and that teaming happens both, in concentric circles of within the near term, the inner circles of the USGS, going all the way out and including academic partners. And this is super important, super powerful, but complicated. Next slide. This will be my last slide. And in doing this, we try to incorporate these ideas of open science, human-centered design, but we also have to have, very much systems engineering standards by which we are going to architect these kinds of capabilities. And to do this in a community way, I think is something we look forward to engaging with you all in as part of these kind of conversations. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Gokul.
Thanks, David. I think we have time for one question for David before we move on to Kripa. So if there's any pressing question for David, please feel free to raise your hand now. We will have time during the discussion section for a more complete discussion and question and Q&A.
Yeah, thank you. I'll look forward to that. Okay,
great. So I guess we'll move on to our next speaker. Welcome, Kripa Jagannathan. So Kripa is a research scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Really a pleasure to have you here and offer your thoughts on your experience regarding R2O2R. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Coco, and thanks, everyone. I am going to focus my remarks today on how engaged research or bringing in users in the process of research can actually be fruitful for R2O2R. And I'll draw a little bit from Bob's comments. One reason why R2O2R is complex is because the words research and operations, we throw it around, but they can mean many different things. They're not very simply defined. So for example, Bob really explained this quite a bit. Even within the MSD community, research can mean, building a fundamental MSD modeling framework, or it can mean something very applied like building a decision support tool, or even outreach and communication can be forms of research. At the same time, operations or use of research can also mean many different things. It can range from improving conceptual understanding of a problem, communicating new or emerging risks that we didn't really know about, or using research as data into an operations models. And the way that research and operations often connect is through user engagement. Yet as a scientific community, despite this complex landscape, we tend to think of users only when we're thinking of how do I give this data to users, or how do I communicate them? Next, please. So what happened is we have a round peg. Sorry, before that, Pat. We have a round peg square hole problem is that, we try to make our tools shinier and shinier, yet the underlying science and all of the other stages of research have been developed without the operational context or without users in mind. So no matter how shiny we make it, or how many better communication tools or social media we use, the fundamental science underlying these tools, if it's not user relevant or operational relevant, it ends up not being as used. So next slide, please. engaged research flips this perspective that users come in only at the end of the research, right? Engaged research views users as knowledge holders who can improve all types of research. And there's more and more empirical evidence now that have studied these processes and showcased that even when you have user engagement in fundamental research, you tend to develop more impactful scientific innovative research. And there's a lot of evidence now coming up on this. And then this research also tends to be more useful for operations. Next slide, please. So I'll give you an example of the hyperfacets project that Bob alluded to. And here we used engaged research to improve fundamental science. So hyperfacets is now in its 7th year. We have a lot of data about how it worked or didn't work. And the main aim is not to develop a decision support tool. We're doing climate modeling, yet our over 40 researchers now are engaging with about 30 water, energy, and land managers. So how did practitioner engage improve our fundamental research? We actually systematically evaluated all 6 years of our research and pinpointed what actually changed in this time by engaging with practitioners that we would have otherwise not done. Next slide, please. What we found was that, a lot of our research goes through this very typical research journey. All of us do this as researchers: identify a problem, have a research question, we have our approach, modeling, and then results. The next click, please. What we found was that no matter, even if we had our research topic in area, at each step of this journey, we as researchers were making many crossroad decisions or prioritizations, often by ourselves. So for example, when we looked at tropical storms, the first question was, should I look at storm tracks, storm frequency, intensity, flooding, storm surge, sea level rise? Questions were plenty, and we couldn't do everything. All of them were valuable, yes, but what do you prioritize? Which models do you prioritize? Which simulations, which metrics? Should you focus on all extreme storms, or should you focus on a worst case extreme storm? Next click, please. So having urban planners who had local knowledge and operational context who were able to tell us, focus on this, maybe this is the biggest research gap, was really imperative in hyperfacets. Next click, please. And even when we had things like what metrics, how to validate this, how to prove the credibility of this work, these local experts, because they knew operationally what was important in this process, were able to help us make each stage of this research journey a lot more rigorous. Now, if you're a new researcher and you find this overwhelming, actually we had some success in hyperfacets, even in research topics where we didn't sort of engage users in each one of these steps of the research journey. So in some of our topical areas, we were only able to engage with researchers while identifying the problem or refining a research question. And still we found that our overall research was a lot more innovative and impactful, also user relevant, but overall we also felt that our process was more rigorous. So A-okay to start small. If you're thinking of user engagement, you might really have a lot of benefit even with that. It was the lesson learned. Last slide, next slide, please, Pat. So I'll leave you with this thought that, I feel like the biggest, one more, Pat, sorry. I feel like the biggest contribution that the working group can make is to flip the role of the user as a knowledge holder who can improve the research process. Users can help us ask better research questions and conduct better and more rigorous research. This means that practitioners can actually help us in any type of research. And we don't need to engage with them through very rigorous co-production, at least to start with. If we can help identify some of these tangible entry points for researchers who are looking to do this for the first time, help identify the right practitioners. We can't really go to a ground emergency manager and say, well, how does climate change impact you? That doesn't often work. And provide a mutual space for learning these operational contexts in general that helps us make this, sort of second nature to understand these contexts and connect with people who already work with people on the ground. So I feel like I leave this as food for thought and end with saying we need to not have the round peg square hole problem, and seeing users as knowledge holders is one step forward to that. Thanks.
Great. Thanks a lot, Krupa. Very interesting presentation. So with that, we move on to our third esteemed speaker, Jenny Rice, who's a senior research scientist at Pacific Northwest National Lab. Jenny, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Gokul. Yeah, it's really interesting to hear everyone else who's come before me, and just to realize that we all bring our different lenses to this topic of R2O2R. And I think there's a lot of commonalities, but maybe some subtle differences that would be interesting to discuss later on. So I'm going to give you my framing, the way I think about this. So what do we really mean by R2O2R? Is it starting with research and thinking about how it could be used in operations, and then getting feedback and having that influence our research? Is it this, or is it really, next slide, please, is it really more of a continuum where we want to be always somewhere in this infinity diagram, where, you know, on the right, we're really looking at the stakeholder informed kind of science that Bob funds in the MSD program area. On the left, more the stakeholder facing applied science research. And of course, to the far left, you could envision more like industry consulting. And, you know, this is sort of consistent with Bob's framing. And then to the far right of this diagram, you might be in the pure basic research realm. But I think that for me, it's valuable to think about this as a continuum, and that we always want to be moving through this diagram. And depending on where our funding is coming from, will determine, you know, where we are actually in this diagram. So I'm going to give some examples next from some of the work I've been involved in IM3, which is stakeholder informed research, and then talk about some stakeholder facing research. So my perspective on stakeholder informed research is that it needs to address classes of problems, right? Not those of a specific decision maker. So this is very much consistent, and some might say Richard and I are joined at the hip in terms of thinking in terms of typologies, right? So this is really important. We're trying to get insights relevant and useful to a wide range of stakeholders. Really critical, in my view, that stakeholder informed research be open source and, have fair data to facilitate ease of use in fundamental as well as in applied science when we go to that next part of the diagram. So a couple of examples from the IM3 project, integrated multi-sector, multi-scale modeling, for which I am the PI again. So we had this research that gave us a lot of information about watersheds across the US and land use characteristics. And we realized that there was an opportunity to try to develop a classification of those watersheds and to understand how they might cluster, for example, based on certain characteristics. And this led us to write a paper for Nature Communications that was the first ever national scale classification of the potential contamination of urban drinking water sources as a function of their source watersheds and the land use there. So that's a diagram from that study on the right that received quite a bit of notice in the regular media, because it really helped characterize the threats to drinking water across the US that had never been done before in this consistent way. And then a second example is understanding, we do in basic science and in MSD science, we've done a lot of sort of long-term planning, focus on projections of how the world will evolve. And it's hard sometimes to get on the ground reality into some of our modeling. So as part of IM3, we have a model that does power plant siting. And so the goal with this model was to produce large scale sightings across, say, the entire US or entire regions, but have that siting algorithm be informed by the actual processes that are used in the real world to make siting decisions. So that's been an algorithm development that was definitely informed by the real world, but was certainly not stakeholder facing. So next slide. So stakeholder facing work that that I've been involved in is actually been able to leverage a lot of the IM3 software development and modeling tools. And so PNL has a project called Go Deep, which is grid operations, decarbonization, environmental and energy equity platform. And this is a stakeholder-facing effort that is to try to help address the challenges of decarbonization for grid operations and capacity expansion planning, as well as and to address the challenges of doing this in an equitable fashion. So we're using the GChem USA model, which is obviously funded by MSD, the TEL model, which is a load forecasting model, and then the SURF model, which again, which I just mentioned. And so all of these enhancements that we're making for Go Deep are being done in an open source manner. They're being managed through GitHub. So this stakeholder facing research is producing new science that now is very useful, coming back into the more basic science or stakeholder informed science that's funded by MSD. So the final slide is just an example of this. So for example, what we have now, completing that loop in that infinity diagram, going from Go Deep back to IM3, we have enhanced analytics and additional geospatial modeling that's coming out of Go Deep. So we're understanding from stakeholders, you know, what are, like, there's a real concern about how power plant siting might be of new renewables, especially. What kind of objections might there be on the ground to large scale wind and solar? And that has led us to develop new analytics to better understand how the model can help inform those decisions. And we've also seen the opportunity to use the siting constraints on the ground that we see with the high resolution geospatial modeling to be able to better inform GChem USA in terms of how it initializes its assumptions for the availability of wind and solar in different states. So by incorporating these improvements back into the MSD funded modeling arena, now we're enhancing those basic science models, which create new opportunities for stakeholder facing applications. And so we can keep that loop going. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jenny. That was an excellent presentation. Very nice to see the R2O2R loop being completed in some of the projects that you're engaged in. So with that, I think we can open the floor for some discussion. We do have about like 7 to 8 minutes for questions and comments for our panelists. And let me open the floor to the audience here. Anyone that wants to go first, and yes, I do want to note that we want to try to be concise in our questions and our responses because we are running slightly behind schedule. Richard?
Yeah, so maybe I've got, I mean, so many questions. These are great talks, and I'd like to include Bob Valerio if he's back in responding, since we didn't have time specifically for him. But I'm just curious, I'll be brief. What advice would all the panelists have for our working group? And what do you think makes it successful for scientists and people who have more operational concerns to work together? As you all know, there's been a lot of research that kind of points at different pitfalls. Given the space we're operating in, I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that.
David, Jenny, or Krupa, any responses?
I'll just jump in with a quick comment that like in so much of what we do, and even just within the space of multi-sector dynamics, the words that we use, the terms that we use, our lexicon is hugely important to be aware of different lexicons. So when one is working with the more operational or stakeholder facing individuals, I think it's really important to understand their terminology, their language, And that the translational part, which Kripa mentioned, I think is critical. So how do we go from that, we could call it in quotes, more real world issues and take that back into the MSD arena. So I think there is a lot of the need for expertise and people that can do that kind of translation.
David and or Kripa, any further responses?
I'll just say that out of all the stakeholders out there, a lot of people, it's kind of an infinite problem, but within the different government agencies and bureaus, there's a spectrum, going from basic research to applied. And there's many of our colleagues that are really well versed in what the problems are, like, people at Bureau of Rec or Army Corps of Engineers, and they don't always get it right, but they have a lot of just accrued knowledge about, what matters. So, and that could be a very efficient way to kind of just capture key things that, would inform how we fill gaps through research. That's just one thought, but.
And my comment is similar to David's actually, is that it occurs that we can all learn a lot about how to make our own research more operationally useful by talking to each other. We don't even need to go to users sometimes. Yes, sometimes we do. It's not always feasible. And even as a co-production expert, I understand that and I recognize it. But I feel like if the working group can provide a space for all of our researchers to ask the question, this is what I'm trying to work on. This is what I'm thinking I will work on. And this is my approach. How, in your perspective, can I make this more operationally relevant? And learn from each other and just use these spaces, not as just, okay, here's what I'm doing. How will someone use it? But how can I change it's a different, slightly shift in perspective. Are there little tweaks? Are there bigger changes that you would make based on your understanding of research gaps or operational gaps? And I feel like if we can even start doing that, it will be a start. Otherwise, I feel like we end up not using these spaces as efficiently as possible. So yeah, a space for how do I iterate my research, in your opinion, how can I change my research to be more operationally relevant would be a great space, I think, for the working group.
Great. Jen Morris has a question. Jen?
Yeah, thanks to everyone so far. This is maybe for Kripa, but any of the panelists who might have thoughts about, I guess, the level of formality in terms of the engagement with users or stakeholders, aside from kind of collaborative projects. If you're trying to get input at different stages of your research, there's differences in kind of having connections in your network or sponsors that you interact with versus like focus groups or pulling from more social science type approaches of engaging surveys and that type of thing. Do you have any thoughts on kind of the differences in the level of formality of eliciting that type of interaction?
Absolutely. It is a constant struggle with a project that is more fundamental research for me personally, but all of our engagements, I think not all, most of our engagement are actually formal engagements, structured engagements that are conducted, at least facilitated by people with social science expertise. And one main reason for our success, I think, like Jennifer, you pointed that out, is the structured nature of these engagements, because you're not just talking to them, you're using decades of research on participatory research, community engaged research on how to effectively elicit information from users. And that is a skill set that is specific to particular people. So even if we do informal engagements, if there are some people in the Hyperfacets project here, they know that me and my other social sciences colleagues will ask, how are you doing in your presentation? What question are you asking? Why are you asking this question? You can't just say, how will you use this? It has to be, how will you use this? Like we can't ask an emergency planner to just look at a presentation in 10 minutes and say, how will I use this? You know, this is our bread and butter for 10 years. That's just not how it works. So methods of effectively engaging come from history of social sciences. There are groups, Richard just reminded me that I'm part of a working group on the science of actionable knowledge. There's a science to doing user engagement. And even if you're doing it casually, there is a science behind doing that. So for me, outreach and communication are also sciences. There's a science of science communication. And I think being aware of some of these tools and techniques and engaging with experts there is very critical. And a point that I didn't bring up. So Jennifer, thank you for bringing that up. Effective engagement is what we want, not just let's go talk to whoever we have time to talk to.
Great. So with that, I think let me thank the panelists for today, Kripa, David, and Jenny, for the excellent presentations, your excellent perspectives, and also to all those that asked the questions and for your responses back again. So with that, I think we can move on to the next item on the agenda, and I'll turn it over to Jen Morris to take it forward.
All right, great. So this is the portion where we're going to ask participants to participate to help gather some knowledge from you all. And so it kind of actually leads from the question and response that we just had with Kripa. We'd like you to open the Google Doc, which should be in the chat, and take first a few minutes to answer some of these two prompts that you see here. We'd love if you could include your name and institution for your inputs. If you don't feel comfortable, though, that's all right. And we're really trying to get an idea of what type of R2O2R engagement is happening in your research right now. Is this something that's kind of mainstream that you do typically in your research? Is it new? Are you doing it kind of more on the informal side? And what is it that you're doing? What type of operational experts are you engaging with? Or if you're more on the operational side, are you engaging with more fundamental researchers? So what interactions are you having in your current research? So if you could take some time to type some of that out, that would be great. And then the second prompt is about the challenges and opportunities related to an applied dimension of your work. So things that you've encountered or opportunities you see. So I'll give everyone a few minutes to start getting some thoughts down on the Google Doc, and then we'll kind of start discussing them. So I will invite everyone to continue to type, but as we do, I'm going to kind of call on some folks to maybe verbally bring up what they've been writing so we can get some discussion going. So let's see. I might catch you mid-typing, Hedef, at USGS, but do you want to talk a bit about your work with the Delaware River Basin Commission?
Hi, I'd be happy to talk about it. I will warn you that there's some construction in the building. They may have taken a break now, but it may get noisy and I might not be able to keep speaking. So we have a multi-institution effort that involves, colleagues at the USGS, Pat Reed and his team, and colleagues from NCAR. And this began as sort of an exercise in integrated modeling, but has evolved with time to be a prototype for how we can conduct regional water availability assessments in support of the Secure Water Act needs that David Blesmas mentioned in his effort. And so Pat, as part of our team early on, pointed out to us how important it was to have that stakeholder engagement. And so we have, reached out and met with the Delaware River Basin Commission. The Office of the Delaware River Master is within the USGS, so that's been an easier engagement. And then recently with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to understand how the system is operated and managed and what the criteria are. And so, we're still in the early stages of this engagement. It's been mainly to learn from them, to know what the priority issues are that we should address and how we can craft scenarios that would be of relevance to them. And I'll just mention that this, even within the USGS, we sort of have a research to operations component because that work is being done under a project that is sort of where things get developed and tested, but we have another project sort of where we want to implement those methods more broadly across multiple regions across the United States. So we're also trying to think about how can we take that test work in that basin and turn it into a more standardized method for regional water availability assessments.
Excellent, thank you. That's a wonderful first call out. How about, I'm looking at Thomas Carvales, who's been working on a Puerto Rico project. Is there something you want to say on that?
Yeah, this is the Puerto Rico 100% renewable transition project. It's a multi-lab project led mostly by NREL. And one of the major challenges that we have is in the case of Puerto Rico, you have multiple overlapping institutions that design, manage, and operate, right? So you have LUMA, you have PREB, and you have different investors. So even just trying to get all the parameters from our stakeholder engagement processes, sometimes you have actually contestations that happen between entities. So that's been a major challenge for us. And then just trying to map all those layers of management decisions that go into that system, right? Just mapping that and trying to get our parameters set for models has been a challenge.
Yeah, this is, I think, a great point, that as we get closer to stakeholders and we're dealing with complex multi-sector systems, there can be different priorities and objectives for different stakeholders. And I think one of the key research areas for multi-sector dynamics research is helping to inform that type of decision making where there are competing objectives and trade-offs, and how do we look at and think about and quantify these types of trade-offs. So I think that's another really great area of connection between MSD research in particular and operations of what are the methods used to kind of balance different perspectives and needs of different stakeholders. So I would, let me move down a little bit to see if anyone got to some other types of challenges that we might see. How about Jared Smith? I see you've written some here. Do you want to speak to what you've written?
Yeah, sure. This is also based on work that we've been doing in the Delaware and some other work that I've done at USGS, and recognizing that our stakeholders tend to have questions that maybe our models are not ready to answer. We need to learn how to represent different operations or dynamics, or go to finer scales to meet their decisions that they're making. So I think that's a common challenge across the board when we think about operations. It's just our models ready to go to that scale.
Absolutely. Personally, that's one of the first things that flashes out to me as a challenge is the scale. What scales are we talking about? And can we get to the finer scales that a lot of these real operational decisions are made at? And so I do think it's a challenge, but hopefully, like you said, also an opportunity of how can we connect different tools at different scales? How can we provide important information about boundary conditions that are coming from maybe global dynamics or broader regional dynamics that actually do have an impact on what's happening at the finer scale, but are outside of kind of the finer scale decision-making models that are being used. So making those connections, I think, is an important area that hopefully we can explore more within the context of this working group. So I would, we're going to switch to a second prompt. We really appreciate you taking the time to write your thoughts here, and we will certainly be using these as we are formulating our research group and its objectives and plans. But I do want to leave the floor open for anybody who would like to speak about something they've written. Kripa, yes.
I don't want to dominate this, but I did see a little bit of a theme that people were alluding to. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Is that, we think that if we just engage with stakeholders, everything will be fine. We'll know what they want. But actually, I think it's not as simple. Understanding what our users are saying and then translating that to what does this mean to our operational products or research is also a non-trivial task and has a lot of layers of translation and what we can do, and not just understanding that what we can do within our own scopes and resources is, I feel a lot of folks are alluding to, like there's some things that our models and tools can do, and there's some things that our users need, and there is that in-between space. And I feel like it takes engaging with our user communities' feedback as actual data. And that's not something that many quantitative researchers are used to doing. So a big part of Hyperfacets and a lot of our other projects is actually I have a meeting with scientists to discuss the stakeholder engagement that they were a part of already, see what did we actually get out of it. So just wanted to bring that in. It's not just engaging with users, it's translating what they're saying into something tangible that we can do in research to operations is a whole other task. Sorry.
Great point. No, that's a great point. And I think on a slightly related point is I think a lot of times the kind of more research scientists are also hoping that what they're producing might actually influence what the stakeholders want and think that they need. So the need for that two-way communication is very it's a huge need. And I think one of the things that has already come up is really the role of kind of these more formal social science approaches and really solidifying how that type of communication happens. So thank you, everyone. Please do continue to type because these Google Docs will not go to waste. We will be using them, and it's very helpful information. But I am going to hand it off to Jordan Kern, who's going to lead a second set of prompts for everyone. So Jordan, take it away.
Thanks, Jen. All right, so this is our second prompt. And the idea of this one is to develop with feedback from you all some ideas for specific working group activities and products. So the first prompt is asking specifically what contributions do you think would be useful or impactful for this particular working group focused on research to operations and operations to research. And then the second prompt is putting you individually on the spot a little more and asking if there are specific ideas or activities that you would personally be interested in working on. So as you're sort of getting started on both of those, I wrote notes and just wanted to provide some sort of reminders of themes that came up during this session that might be useful, right? So I think that One thing that, kind of sticks out to me is that it can be difficult to conceptualize in my own research, the full spectrum of R2O and then back to research. And so I think it's okay to split it into two if you think that there's a particular activity that might be focused on, for example, operations to research. That builds off of some themes that Kripa brought up about flipping the role of the user or the practitioner as a source of knowledge for researchers specifically. But I think it's also, keeping in mind, I think some of the limitations that Bob brought up, this emphasis on having an impact, influencing human systems, in addition to just sort of studying them. That touches on, all these broader themes that I think are becoming more important across funding agencies like translational research, societal relevance, including convergence. Some other things that stuck out to me in listening to everybody's, really insightful comments throughout. Bob mentioned one, he had a really nice list of principles for moving forward. One of which that I really liked was thinking about things in multiple dimensions, right? Thinking about if there's specific activities that we want to have come out of this, thinking about a set of societal challenges or geographies of interest. He listed some previous examples that might come out as products being like targeted activities or workshops, communication and outreach, but also help for researchers, for individual researchers that might be asking the question, how do I operationalize my own research? So those are all, there's more things I wrote down, but I want to get to the discussion because I know we need to wrap up probably in the next 5 or 10 minutes to give David some time to close us out. So I'm going to, as Jen did, just sort of go through the list of comments here and highlight a couple ones that may deserve, I think they're all deserving, but might have an opportunity for a little more explanation. Let's see. Yeah, so one thing I did write down, and this is would be to, and this is what Tom Wild from PNNL writes, that having a more in-depth stock take of the various R2O2R activities that have previously taken place within the MSD community seems like a really valuable one. Tom, did you want to elaborate on that one, or enough said?
Yeah, I guess it's enough said, but I think yeah, I'll just leave it there. I think that could be a really good starting point, and it could maybe even help us bring new folks in, to identify invited speakers or folks we want to try to integrate into the working group.
Folks on the R side or the O side or both?
Yeah, I was thinking about the O side.
Me too. Yeah, I think that I generally have a more persistent hunger to hear from the perspectives of people in operations than research, just because I'm exposed to research a lot and not as much operations. So yeah. I'm with you. Caitlin Grady from George Washington. Would you want to talk about the value that you think this could bring to early career researchers?
Sure. My comment was more hoping that this community can help early career researchers showcase the value within their own portfolio to people who are evaluating them for promotion and tenure and things like that. Because oftentimes, I think the sort of value of stakeholder engagement and operations side of this work sometimes gets lost in our ability to articulate what we spend time on and how we contribute to the academic enterprise in general. And I think this community could help early career researchers more clearly articulate that value within their own trajectories.
For sure. I totally agree with that. I know from my own institution, which is a land grant, there's a big extension outreach component to promotion and tenure, but that's not always the case across universities. And sometimes, I think underlying the value that this could have would be really useful. I also, I think, to sort of piggyback on your point, my own experience is that funding agencies are, and as Bob mentioned, increasingly interested in, researchers that are demonstrating the societal value of their work. And that may also, I think, especially for early career researchers who are trying to get funding, could be useful as well. Let's see. Maybe I'll jump to prompt number 2. Although, let's see, there's not as much going on there. Let's see. Richard, do you want to talk about what you would maybe envision for a series of webinars in terms of coverage over different sectors or sectoral interactions, maybe thinking about how to balance a lineup of speakers or webinars across, picking from among people that are more involved in the R versus the O, or both?
Yeah, I mean, what I was thinking about was the success we had with that 2016 workshop, and it really led to a lot of pretty exciting discussions, I think. And the idea that we had there was that it might be useful over time to look at how different groups of researchers and operational experts were in fact evolving their joint collaborations and the way they were sharing information, across different fields like transportation or healthcare or water resources. I think that there's things that we can learn if we did it in a kind of comparative way, where we said we want each of these webinars to talk about use considerations as well as scientific opportunities, and the methods of engagement. And if we kind of kept a structured approach up over 5 or 6, I think it could lead to some really interesting publications, maybe even a special section of a journal, as well as inform us much more than we currently understand what the state of practice is in the MSD field.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's all great. And I, for one, would be very interested in attending those webinars and if need be, helping to organize them. Thomas from ORNO, I know we already heard from you, but it sounds like you have a very relevant and interesting set of experiences working with stakeholders and overlapping groups of stakeholders. As part of your work in Puerto Rico. Do you want to talk some about that and how it relates to your comment here?
Sure. Yeah, this is a 2-year project, so we're gearing up for the end of the year in December, and we identified an advisory group composed of stakeholders from across Puerto Rico in different sectors. So industry, a slew of NGOs, and it's about 100 people. So it's been kind of wieldy, to deal with. So we have on-site and hybrid meetings bi-monthly. And if you're familiar with Puerto Rico, you understand that there's a few different potential futures, and sometimes they're contested, and they're changing ground truth every day.
Yeah.
There's daily energy changes, new investments, and new regulations and funding being released. So that's kind of been an ongoing challenge for us, right? And you have that many stakeholders, you get a lot of requests, you get a lot of different topics and kind of spread out in different ways. So that's something that we've been trying to sort of anchor down, as well as coming up with a way to evaluate how our engagement is going. So we ended up breaking it down into context, process, and impact. So context is mostly, for the most part, representation. So which sectors are we representing? What is our context? In this case, it's energy system resilience and it's energy transition. But then we also try to evaluate how the process of our engagement is going. So balance between discussion times and the way our presentations are going, if that information is being relevant to them, as well as giving them a chance to give us feedback for the tools that we're building for. So yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up? Because I think one of the things that I took from your written comment is that there's an interest in developing a framework for best practices, right? In terms of how to go about this process of co-production of knowledge with stakeholders or people more on the operational side. And my first thought was, well, Puerto Rico's an island, and from a grid perspective, maybe it would make it easier because it's at least one electrical system. But I think, based on your comments, it's incredibly complex. And so that to me raises this idea of just institutional geographical idiosyncrasies that might make it more difficult to develop these types of best practices. Do you have another case study that you've worked on or know of other folks working on that contrasts a lot with your experience in Puerto Rico?
The only one that I can think of is, it's a very different geographic scale even, just working with the city of Knoxville, which is about a mid-sized city in East Tennessee.
Yeah.
And just building them a climate adaptation tool, for example. So typically instead of being in a room full of people, it was a smaller room, with a round table, so you can get more in depth with particular stakeholders, particular decision makers, and kind of learn more from one person that's working on just a few things instead of having this corpus of folks from different sectors, right? And yeah, the main thing for us is being, how do we evaluate our engagement, right? So there's best practices, but then how do you know you're doing well, and how do you know where you can improve? And right. So that's kind of where we're trying to bring in that reflective aspect.
Cool. Well, thanks. And this has all been great. Thank you for those of you who added written comments to the document, and especially to those of you who are willing to elaborate a little bit more. I think at this point we need to, and as Jen mentioned, this document's not going to go away. I think there'll be opportunities to add more ideas to this and develop it as a working group. So, but at this point, I'm going to hand it back to David, who is, I think, going to close us out.
I can do that. Thanks, Jordan. Can you hear me? Just double checking.
Yep.
Okay. And the reason I ask is because in a twist of fate, my power went out here at home in Tennessee about 5 minutes ago. So I missed a lot of what's been said, but I'm calling in and I can close this out here. It's perfect timing. And it sounded like when I picked it up, some really great discussions were happening. I haven't seen the Google Doc, but we will definitely, as Jen was indicating earlier, be mining this for great ideas as we build out the plans for this working group and the team over time. So I can't see the slides on Zoom, but I guess go to Pat's this slide with this concluding thoughts. I think it's number 50. Just to say again, thanks to everybody who's contributed to this webinar today in the planning and then and operationalizing it here on the call. So to Bob, to David, to Kripa, to Jenny for agreeing to make these contributions and prepare slides ahead of time, and Jen and Jordan for chairing. And then in the background, we hadn't mentioned it yet, but Hassan and Kamal and Cameron have been from PNNL and NC State respectively, have been helping with a lot of note taking, capturing the discussions, things that weren't included on the Google Doc or weren't captured there. So that's fantastic. Thanks again to Bob Valario and his team at DOE for their support. Again, it comes in different forms, not just funding, but just in terms of the ideas and carving out this new space here over the past years. And we're all excited about where it's going to go. So thanks. Yes, and then in that same breath, yeah. So the success of this working group depends entirely, really, on participation from the community, the folks who are here today, but also others who will join in the future. And as we've been discussing, it's not just research community, but the operations community and the people that have a foot in both would be fantastic as we build this out over time. So for any of you here, or if you have any friends or colleagues who you think would be interested, please let us know. There are different ways to engage in a more or less active role, depends on your time and your interest. So you can simply contact me or GoCool or Richard by email. And then if you go to the next slide, Pat, should be the slide which has the screenshot of the Join Us form on the Multi-Sector Dynamics website. You can sign up not only for our working group, but if you have interest in any of the other working groups, you can definitely sign up. You can sign up to the MSD newsletter. We would encourage you all to do that. Just to give you a little glimpse, if you go to the next slide with the pictures of a few of us, this is the current composition of the working group as it stands now. But again, I mean, this is an open invitation for others to please let us know if you'd like to join. So in addition to myself and GoCool and Richard, who have been kind of building this out here in the beginning, some people you see on the right here who have who expressed some interest very early on, even more than a couple months ago when this working group was announced, and now we finally got to this point of having the kickoff webinar. But Natalie Voisin at PNNL, and Simha Rao at Yale, Tom Wild, and Jenny, who was on speaking today, also from PNNL, and then Jen and Jordan, who were just sharing. We would welcome any other colleagues from the let's say the U.S. National Lab world, the university world, from the operations side, USGS, other agencies. That would be great. In particular, it would be really great to have some early career researchers who involved in this, because that's in large part what this MSD community of practice more generally is trying to do, is build up that cohort of early career researchers in the MSD space. So next slide, just on the next steps. This we're going to take this feedback that we received today. We're going to grow the team out and evolve it so it's more diverse. And this webinar is just the first in a series of probably other webinars, workshops, and other activities that were discussed today to bridge, the MSD researchers and operations and to learn on both sides. And I would just then add, with now zooming out just a bit, a couple final slides for everyone's awareness. If we go to slide 54, it's about the MSD workshop. So some of you will have heard about this, maybe not every single person on the call. There's going to be the first ever multi-sector dynamics workshop in person at UC Davis in early October. The application or the abstract submission deadline, I think, has been extended till this Friday midnight, in case there's any folks out there who would still be interested. But this will be a great meeting on, as you can see, the title, Advancing Complex Adaptive Human Earth System Science in a World of Interconnected Risks. There's 4 workshop themes you can see in this box on the right, one of which is, well, they're all related to operational, research operations in some way, shape, or form, but that first one is really going to focus on it, inspiring operational relevance in the climate change and energy transition spaces. So this is something to watch if you're interested in coming, or even if you don't, just look for the outcomes of that. And then finally, last slide is about the Earth's future, the journal Earth's Future, the special collection that has just recently been launched and has the submission window period until December 2024. That's not a typo. It's December after this next one, and it's very closely linked with the Davis workshop, and which is going to be a nice waypoint sort of in the middle of this submission window. So we'll be able to use that to catalyze some papers, very collaborative papers, multi-sector dynamics papers, towards that special issue. And you can see the organizers here. So if you would have any questions about that, please ask. So with that, I'm going to bring it. I think we're ready to close. Pat, if there's anything else you wanted to say, because you can see what's happening on the screen, or Richard or GoCool, feel free. But that's all from my end. Thanks everybody for joining.
Yeah,
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.